Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a cryptic categorizer, a fastidious student of seascapes, bringing you tales from topographic oceans. Here to talk to you today about Mercury in Virgo opposite Saturn in Pisces, but also about the duality of the energies of Virgo and Pisces in general. I feel looking at the pairings of the zodiac signs and of how they represent the interplay and division of two polarities is so important in understanding the individual signs, because the way in which they oppose one another gives definition, focus, clarity, and structure to the nature of each side. And when we are looking at the polarities of Virgo and Pisces, we are seeing the interplay between the infinite and the finite, between the perfectly structured classifications of the flora and fauna of the natural world given to us by Carl Linnaeus versus all of the mysteries, marvels, and inexplicable monsters that clutter up our utterly inexplicable world, between the carefully ordered and structured, between the apparently random, desultory and chaotic, between the unspoken language of music and the perfect definitions that the spoken word attempts to bring out of that void of mystic silence. One of the ways in which I want to attempt to bring together these complex, disparate themes is by looking at well-known writers who have Mercury in Virgo and those who have Mercury in Pisces, as well as those who have oppositions between the two signs, so that we can have a better exemplification of how these two different signs look at and experience the world, because Mercury is all down to how we perceive the world and how we process, digest, assimilate, and then express all the information that we are receiving. Mercury is a symbol of the mind that acts as a filter and a go-between between our inner world and our outer world. So if you imagine everything that's going on out there and everything that's going on in here is almost like this constant ocean of sensory and spiritual data with which we are constantly being flooded. Mercury is the part of us that receives that flood of information and then breaks it down into the bits that it considers are important, and then gets rid of the stuff that it says is just static, that is just noise, that is not relevant and which it doesn't need to pay attention to. And so our minds are always doing this. Our minds are often choosing not to look at something, not to see something, because it doesn't have the energy to be working at total capacity at all the time. Our brains are finite, whilst the range of possible things we could experience and perceive is infinite. So it has to break things down to its biological, organic level so that our central nervous systems aren't swamped and reduced to incapacity by the sheer level of stuff that they are trying to make sense of. It says, okay, I only have this amount of energy and this amount of attention I can possibly give to anything, and I'm relying on my mind, my Mercury, to tell me the important things that are going on in my outer environment and my inner environment and alert me to them, and to trust that everything else that is unimportant will be brushed aside. You know, when someone has a very clear, focused mind, like when we are reading a book or when we are totally absorbed in a film or a piece of music, our Mercuries are able to say in that moment, I want all of my attention to go on this thing, therefore for that brief period while I am involved in these things, whilst I am immersed in these things, I am going to shut out the rest of the world. I'm going to let Mercury turn off its filter and just focus its lens on this one direction. But the prime difference, I would say, that exists between Mercury in Virgo and Mercury in Pisces is the level of filter that each does or does not possess. Mercury in Virgo has a very heightened filter. It's very good at filtering out all the noise and static that it doesn't want and just focusing on what it has decided is relevant, important, and germane, of finding the right patterns and details in everything that it is looking at and then shutting out everything else. Whereas Mercury in Pisces has no filter. It leaves itself in a state of total receptivity and so experiences everything all at once in this tsunami of sensory experience. Mercury in Pisces is like a radio station, a radio that is picking up all radio frequencies simultaneously and playing them at once. It doesn't matter whether it's picking up jazz SM, radio free, classic rock, it's playing them all at the same time in this big, chaotic, symphonic cacophony of shared, total, infinite sound. In the Mercury and Virgo radio set, it has neatly divided all of these frequencies into different radio stations so that they can be listened to separately. You can tune into the ones that you want, you don't have to tune into the ones that you don't want. The disparity of these two modes of perceiving and experiencing the world can be seen in different literary genres. On the Mercury and Virgo side, we have the literary realism that was fashionable in the 19th century. And then after that, we have the magical realism or the hyperrealism and modernism of the early 20th century. In the 19th century literary realism, people wanted to write books that accurately conveyed the experience of practical earthly reality. They didn't want to write fantasies and fables and fairy tales. They wanted to write books that explored life as it was and as it is, dealing with real-world themes like people, relationships, industry, politics, society, money, and how all of these things come together. They wanted to describe ordinary, real people, not towering archetypal heroes and heroines battling against dragons and monsters, but, you know, people like you and me and the types of things we actually experience. They wanted books that could touch on the core of the mundane and find the deeper psychological significance in these things. But as we neared the 20th century, this literary realism began to be challenged by the modern avant-garde that said, yes, sure, there might be some value in these books of literary realism, but there's also a lot that they edit out in the name of a so-called material reality. They forget that our experience of reality is often surreal and interwoven with dreams and imagination and free association, that it can be strange and wondrous and disordered and doesn't often leave room for the little forms of madness that can creep into our everyday awareness. And so they introduced this new technique in writing known as stream of consciousness, whereas instead of having this perfectly ordered, neat prose with a nice plot and structure, where everything's nice and paragraphed and you can always separate one character and one dialogue from another, instead they said, let us write in a perfect stream of consciousness where we allow things to rise up spontaneously from the unconscious mind, where we mix everything together in a bizarre oceanography of prose. And two of the writers who were most famous for trailblazing the stream of consciousness technique were Joyce and Virginia Woolf, both of whom had Mercury in Pisces and who wrote books that tried to convey reality in that raw, unfiltered, strange, messy way. I'll give you a little example of what I mean by this by reading you a small paragraph from James Joyce's Ulysses. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that if no more fought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, the rusty boot, snot green, blue silver rust coloured signs, limits of the diaphany, but he adds, in bodies. Then he was aware of them bodies before of them coloured. How? By knocking his sconce against them sure. Go away. Bold he was, and the millionaire, maestro di colour Cesano. Limits of the diaphany in? Why in? Diaphany? A diaphany. If you can put your 5 fingers through it, it is a gate. If not, a door. Shut your eyes and see. So what this passage is actually describing is the main character, Stephen Dedalus, walking on a beach, and all of his different philosophical and theological cogitations going round and round in his brain, but also responding to his vivid sensory impressions of the beach littered with bladderwrack that he is walking on. And instead of dividing these things into neat little sentences where they could be readily understood, they're instead all mixed together. And the point these stream of consciousness Mercury and Pisces writers were saying is that this is true reality. Reality isn't neat paragraphs and sentences and quotation marks and punctuation and grammar. Raw reality is an unfiltered, infinite totality, a clustering together of many things that all add up to convey the bewilderment of but hazily known human experience. And then likewise in Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway, which on a mundane level mostly focuses around the social events leading up to a dinner party held by the titular character, we also have this lack of division between the characters, where we might be having one character and having them walking through the streets of London and experiencing all the different poetic sensations that they feel in response to their environment, but then they might pass someone on the street, and before you know it, suddenly halfway through that paragraph, you are now learning all about the thoughts and perceptions of that person that they passed. So everything is always mutating from one person to the other. We have divine philosophical cogitations sat side by side with someone ruminating about their breakfast or how they don't like that person's hat. Everything is experienced together all at once. And one of the characters in the novel is a man called Septimus, who is mad after his experiences in the war. From having previously been a rational, witty gentleman, he is now someone who believes he's in contact with the dead, who is having God speak to him, who believes that everything around him is a symbol, is a message, is a communication from some kind of terrible revelation about the true nature of existence. And he's so thwarted and overwhelmed by all these visions and messages he feels he's having from the other world that he's gone completely incommunicado and is more or less catalytic and unresponsive to his poor wife, who keeps getting these awful doctors in to see him. So that character almost represents Mercury and Pisces taken to its extreme, where it is so in touch with the unfiltered divinity and strangeness of what is pouring from the other world that it can no longer function in the rational, ordered, paragraphed world of the Mercury in Virgo mind, that even if it is very intellectual, being an earth sign is always trying to be practical and rooted in the world at the same time that it is trying to understand that world. So whilst we have James Joyce with his Mercury in Pisces giving us the final chapter of Ulysses, where there is no punctuation marks, no full stops, just never-ending run-on sentences, and then his bizarre book Finnegan's Wake, which is made up from an entirely original idioglossia of language where there is no normal words, just all these complex puns, all fused together to try and give and convey the strange mutability of dreams, where everything is always merging into one another. One of the most famous historical figures we have with Mercury in Virgo is Dr. Johnson, who instead of all this incomprehensible avant-garde chaos, gave us the dictionary, the first proper English dictionary in which he attempted to bring together all of the known words at that point and assemble them alphabetically into some kind of everlasting tome that would be the authority on the meaning of language and the meaning of words. So you can see here there's a very different way of approaching the world. One wants to keep everything oceanic and freeform, that doesn't want to miss everything, that is happy with randomness and chaos and madness, and wants to be open and receptive to the numinous and the magical and the strange in everyday experience, versus one that wants to order the world into the understood, that wants to nail down words as not being like these vague impressionistic colours, but things that have definite meanings that we can trust and which we can use to label reality. We can see this schism between Mercury in Pisces and Mercury in Virgo in the Christian creation myth or other biblical utterances, where in the beginning there was the void and those mysterious pre-existent waters over which the face and breath of God hovered. But then God said, "Let there be light," and suddenly something was born out of words. That Mercury in Pisces ocean was given a clarity by Virgoan language. Later on it also says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. So there's this idea that language created the world, that the world in some way is a book that was written, that will go on being written, and that if we can learn to understand that language through our own language, then we can understand the world better. And in many senses, this tells us something about Mercury in Virgo, that Mercury in Virgo more or less sees the world as being composed out of words, out of individual things, out of data, out of different elements that it can distinguish and separate. If Mercury in Pisces experiences the totality of the entire symphony, then Virgo looks at the individual members of the orchestra, at the individual notes, and analyzes and assesses how they are all put together. It sees detail rather than totality. It sees the meticulous rather than the overwhelming and the magical and bewildering. So when Mercury in Virgo is seeing the world, it wants to understand it both practically and intellectually. It doesn't want to experience it. It wasn't in the sense of having this mystical union that Mercury in Pisces is striving for. Rather, it understands there needs to be a degree of detachment and dissociation between the observed and the observer. In Mercury in Pisces, the observed and the observer become one. The person experiencing and the thing being experienced have no boundaries between them. Whereas Mercury in Virgo is a student of nature, observing nature. There is a degree of separation, of self-containment, because when things are separated into individual things, they are easier to process, they are easier to categorize, they are easier to analyze and understand. It sees a complex whole, takes it apart, and then puts it back together again. Rather than being overawed by the whole, it says, no, let's break this down to its core element, figure out the meaning and the purpose and the relevance of each element, and then put it back together again as a structural whole. And one of the erroneous assumptions that many people have about the energy of Virgo is that it is a clean freak that likes its environment to be perfectly ordered and perfected at all times. And whilst that is sometimes true, but very often not, Mercury in Virgo concerns the mind. And it is true that Mercury in Virgo wants to have a well-ordered mind. It wants to have a mind where everything is neat and compartmentalized. It doesn't want one of these messy minds that is just full of trash and gibberish and monkey noise. It wants a mind that is a well-refined tool, because it understands the whole purpose of the mind is it as a part of our biological organism. It's meant to help us have a relationship with the world, to understand the world, to work with the world, and to develop skills that make the world a more manageable place for us and which ensures our survival. It is a piece of machinery, and just as we learn to drive a car or to play a guitar by studying the techniques that refine our performance, likewise, Mercury in Virgo is concerned with treating its mind as a machine and understanding that a mind works well if we can work with it, if we can discipline it, if we can tame it, if we can control our minds and give order to them rather than just allowing them to control us. So Mercury in Pisces surrenders to the mystery of the mind, whilst Mercury in Virgo strives to make the mind knowable, which is why many Virgos and people with Mercury in Virgo are often interested in psychology and in astrology, in these things that take the invisible strangeness of the mind and try and map it out into terra cognita by dividing it into different personality types like we do in both astrology and psychology. But Mercury in Virgo often describes a nervous, restless mind. Once you've accepted that your mind is a machine, something that you can perfect and improve and become a master, artisan and virtuoso of, then every moment of your existence is an opportunity to make your mind work better. Mercury in Virgo has a strong feeling that it should know everything, because it longs to have a mind that is sufficient unto itself, that can be an expert in all things, that can be a jack of all intellectual trades. It is seldom willing to just rest with what it already knows, because it is always critical of itself and the gaps that it possesses in its knowledge. It is always looking to develop new skills, to learn and study new things it has never studied before, because the more it knows, the more its mind is reliant only on itself and no one else. It is an autodidact. If someone else possesses information that you do not, then you become reliant upon them. You become dependent on them, and that's very uncomfortable for Mercury in Virgo, that wants to be self-sufficient and self-contained. It wants to possess all the knowledge itself, to be someone else that someone else comes to for knowledge, rather than being a student who is dependent on the utterances of their teacher. The more it knows for itself, the more it can do for itself, and the less it has to worry about potentially being controlled by someone else. Well, Dr. Johnson, our Mercury in Virgo personage, was able to write the dictionary because he was considered to be one of the most learned, intelligent, and well-read men of his age. And having heard of this formidable cerebral reputation that he had, I was quite surprised when I read The Life of Dr. Johnson by James Boswell and discovered that actually Dr. Johnson was a bit of a speed reader. When he would read books, he wouldn't sit down and meticulously and carefully work through every single last word. No, he would skim through. And this relates to what I was saying about Mercury in Virgo filtering out the noise, filtering out the chaos, filtering out the static to build up a relevant picture of something. Mercury in Virgo knows that actually a lot of books are filler, are rambling, are useless sentences that don't really want to be there. Mercury in Virgo wants to distill things to their most useful and practical utterances. And I think this is why, as a writer, Samuel Johnson was most well remembered for his aphorisms, for his witticisms, for these sayings or phrases that would somehow manage to convey a certain part of experience in the least number of words. It's a bit like the Tao Te Ching, the sacred Taoist text, rather than like many other scriptures being this 1,000-page volume of different things. It consists of, I think, about 82 short poems that sum up mystical truths very concisely. So Mercury in Virgo admires concision, the ability to take a huge, vast, enormous truth and convey it in very direct and precise, accurate means that can be quickly conveyed and understood. So whilst the Mercury and Pisces stream of consciousness writers that we discussed earlier, when they were writing of their experience of reality, chose to leave all the chaos and the white noise mixed in, unabridged with everything else, Mercury in Virgo wants to separate those things. It wants to take the chaos out of the system and show the perfect rational order behind things instead. And the only way we can engage in this process of intellectual filtration by looking at a lot of data and saying that's meaningless, that's irrelevant, that's noise, that's important, that's meaningful, that needs to be kept in, separating the wheat from the cerebral chaff, is if we have a good critical function, which is what Virgo is all about, the ability to separate things, to tell one thing from another. And the nervousness and the restlessness of the Virgoan mind comes from the fact that it is always criticizing and editing itself. The only way we can improve or perfect our performance in a given area is to look at what we are doing and either ask ourselves, how could I do that, but even better, but also to look at the things we aren't doing well and say, okay, well, how can I get rid of those mistakes? How can I get rid of those imperfections and gradually distill them down until they are gone completely? We need a good critical faculty in order to do that. If someone is playing guitar and yet for some reason it's not sounding right, but they can't figure out why, they can't do anything about it. Whereas when Mercury in Virgo looks at itself playing guitar or looks at someone else playing guitar, it might go, okay, well, you're doing these things well, but these are the things you need to work on. These are the techniques you can do, these are the exercises you can do, and if you follow these, you will be a better performer afterwards. And again, one of the defining features of old Dr. Johnson was that he was a renowned critic, and he particularly enjoyed playing devil's advocate and tearing other people's ideas to pieces, or just generally showing people the limitations or the sloppiness of their thinking. That doesn't mean he wasn't also guilty of sloppy thinking himself, but just as any Mercury can be, but that desire to improve the structuring and the rationality of thought is a driving Virgoan desire. And in his only novel, Rasselas, we see that function coming to the fore, almost moving away from Pisces towards Virgo. Because in the book, the main characters live in this beautiful, undiscovered utopia cut off from the rest of the world where everything is perfect and sadness is unknown. And yet, in spite of that, the main character feels frustrated. He's curious to leave his kingdom of the known and to go out into the world and find out what else is there. And yet he knows if he leaves, he will never be able to return. And chapter by chapter, the characters go out into the world, they discover new people, they meet new philosophies, they meet new cultures and lifestyles, And with each of them, they think they found a panacea, they think they found the answer, they think they found the perfect thing. And yet when they look at it a bit longer, they start to see the weaknesses, they start to see the cracks and the crustiness in the structure, and they go, actually, this isn't the answer at all, I'm going to keep looking. And that is kind of expressing Mercury in a Virgo down to a T, always looking for that authoritative divine truth, and yet always being confronted with the imperfections of reality at the same time. So just as the extremes of Mercury and Pisces can be total madness and inability to function because we are too swamped by the chaotic unknowability of the other world, Mercury and Virgo can become depressed, curmudgeonly, and irritable and nervous because it is always confronted by its heightened perception of what is wrong with the world as it is. Always seeing the faults, always seeing the cracks, always seeing the things that could be better rather than just enjoying what is. Now, I've talked about writers on either side of the Virgo-Pisces divide, but I recently discovered a novelist who manages to bridge both of these gaps and bring them together in a perfect whole. I'm talking about the writer A.S. Byatt, whose novel The Virgin in the Garden I recently read. She has Sun in Virgo, like me. She has Mercury in Virgo, also like me, except her Mercury is opposite Saturn in Pisces, and she also has Venus in Virgo conjunct Neptune, who is the ruler of Pisces. So these polarities exist very strongly in her perception of the world, and that is really well expressed in her fiction, that is able to describe reality and everyday real human experiences with so much detail and accuracy and refinement and possess that makes you feel that she is not only a master psychologist but must have read just about everything under the sun, and yet also has a real talent for showing the strange parts of the human machine, for conveying the experiences of people that don't fit into these neat rational gaps, of conveying the mindsets of people who are visionaries, who do have this imagistic, mediumistic, poetic and overawing relationship with sensory experience. And this divide between the rigidly intellectual Virgo and the mediumistic Pisces is expressed in the novel through the Potter family, who the majority of whom are very, very literary people for whom everything is words, everything is the analysis of English literature and ideas and ideologies, and the willingness to combat and experience the world solely through this lens. If it can't be explained in language, then it doesn't exist to these people who will argue endlessly about Shakespeare, about the poetry of George Herbert, about the sexual revolution of D.H. Lawrence, and who seem to have read just about everything from Chaucer onwards, and to have an intimate unknowingness with the written word. And yet the sun in the family is almost the Saturn in Pisces persona. He's not communicative, he's not literary, he doesn't know how to express himself in words. He doesn't experience this world in this detailed, rational way where it can label exactly what everything is, whether it's Georgian pottery and porcelain, or, you know, giving the Latin names to flowers in the garden. He can't do that like the rest of his family. In his youth, he was known as being a mathematical prodigy, that he could just look at any sum and answer it straight away without rational thought. And what his family didn't know was that he was able to do this because he would have these almost psychic impressions where he would see these strange geometric images in his head that would somehow point him towards the right answer. He experiences the world as this horrible, overwhelming flood of light. He can't tell one thing from another. He often feels like he is being attacked by light, or that his body has no real proper boundary and is always threatening to spread in infinite directions. And he's so overwhelmed by these experiences that he reaches points in the novel where he has breakdowns and he cannot function or communicate with anyone. So we really have this disparity between the Virgoan consciousness at its most extreme and the Pisces consciousness at its most extreme. But A.S. Byatt, having these aspects in her character, wrote these books because she experiences reality in both. Even though you're reading this incredibly detailed prose, she said that that character of Marcus Potter, who was experiencing these strange light phenomenon, was actually autobiographical. So it was describing her, even though one of her other professions is the very Virgoan one of being a critic. Anyway, whichever radio station you have your mercurial antenna pointed towards, whether it's all at once or finely divided stations of your own choosing, I hope you enjoyed this video and were indulgent of my choice to use it as a literary analysis combining different interests of mine. If you have Mercury and Virgo, or Mercury and Virgo opposite any Pisces placements, or just experience the duality between those two signs very strongly in your own chart, please do message me to let me know. I'd love to hear your stories. I learn from your feedback. I am not a perfect astrologer. I am always trying to learn from those around me, like a good Mercury and Virgo person. If you want to, please like, share and subscribe this video. Really helps me to boost the numbers so that I can hopefully do more of all of this in the future. If you want to message me more personally, you can contact me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on Instagram at astrologyandunderwear, and you can support me on Patreon if you so choose at www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled.